And I'm just wondering, so for educators who are wanting to do more, and I know, like, again, I encourage everyone to run out and get the book. I've read it twice already, and I know I'll be reading it again. Um, you have lots of tips in there to help educators to kind of get started on a journey to honoring all of the students within their space and making sure that they're honoring the lenses and lived experiences, especially of the students whose voices have not traditionally been heard within the space, and aren't necessarily fully represented still within the space. Do you have any suggestions of ways for educators to get started? Again, kind of focusing on the K to 12 setting.
Yeah, I think one of the key aspects of what we talk about in education, it all revolves around relationships, what we know about our students and how we can better support. Because if we know more about where our students coming in from and know more about their lived experience and their understanding of the world, the better that we're going to be able to support them. And I know that. As educators, most educators are very much like a type A personality where they like, right?
Mhm.
Like this is here's what I'm gonna do, here's what's gonna like then they're gonna do right. So but that's a part like that's a part of the system and how it's raised us to be that within the system. And when we start talking about let's take a look at things differently, how are there multiple different ways that we can ask students to show us their learning? Does it always have to be written output? I think about that a
Yeah.
lot with my daughter with dyslexia, where she could tell you this amazing story and connect all to the readings and things that she was hearing and talking about. She could talk about it beautifully, but when it came to written output, it wasn't there.
Yeah.
So then she never got marks for it. But she understood it. So how
Yeah.
can we engage in this work of allowing students to show us their brilliance in the ways that work best for them rather than work best for us as
Yeah.
educators? So I always give lots of choice in how students want to show me their learning and understanding of this work. I also include multiple ways of looking at a topic so that I can play on students' strengths within the classroom so that it builds upon who they are as people, because that's what we're doing, right? We're creating this next generation. And when I think about what I would like for the next generation is that I would like them to have a critical lens and not just look at one story that they're given and go, oh, well, that's obviously the truth and move on. I don't want that for the next generation. I want them to go, something about this doesn't seem right, but I'm going to go and I'm going to look up some more and find. I want them to be curious. I want them to ask questions, but most importantly, I want them to feel like they're successful as what it is they are as humans, right? And I've seen this flourish now that my daughter has graduated from school, which was really hard and challenging with her lack of being able to read. Uh,
Yeah.
like she can read, but there's like the challenges that comes with that. And now that she's in this trade program, like she's reading that book every single night and she's learning every single night because she is so invested in the work that she's doing in the classroom and she's so engaged because it's filling something in her. So I think that I think it's a disservice to our students when we don't even allow them to start exploring different things until high school,
Yeah.
right? Where
Yeah.
they get to flourish. So they flourished a little bit, but now like she's just like she's a whole different student now being in a place where something that honors her strengths and her abilities and her understanding of the world. And I think that that's something that we should be doing all throughout education. And we don't have to wait because some students can't wait that long. They just say, oh, this isn't for me and leave, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's so very true, Carolyn. I love how you put that and really focusing on that holistic view of the child and each individual, student, because
there can be so much of that. You have to fit into this perfect box in order to be successful and to move
Mhm.
forward.
Right?
And your book really focuses, so much on the importance of really reaching each of those individual students and having their voices heard throughout the process as well. One
Mhm.
of our favorite quotes from the book is "Inaction is an action."
Mhm.
And it stood out to both of us as soon as we read it there. And, those people who are not necessarily directly impacted by, race, racism, and other forms of discrimination, often feel that simply not being overtly racist or prejudiced or discriminatory in their beliefs and actions is sufficient. Can you expand just a little bit on why inaction can be just as harmful?
Yeah, I think here's what it what it really boils down to is that if nobody changes what students are learning and gaining within the education system, that means that other voices aren't honored, Indigenous stories aren't honored, the real colonial history of this place. If none of that is brought into the education system, we're going to have a next generation of people living here in this place known as Canada doing the exact same thing, and nothing's going to change for myself, for my children, for my grandchildren, and for other historically silenced voices across this place who are um, who are also speaking about the challenges that they encounter as well. And just because you might not be personally impacted by race and racism doesn't mean that you're not part of how we change the system.
Mhm.
Your voices are just as important as my voice within this conversation so that we can do this work together so it can change for other people living in this place, right? Because we're all missing out. If we don't
Yeah.
get to see the Indigenous brilliance that's here and our knowledge and our understanding of the world, we all miss out.
Mhm.
Yes, yes, it's so very true. And that leads in quite nicely to your focus on um, advocating for people to really hold space to center kindness towards themselves and others.
Mhm.
Why is it important to center listening and understanding and social justice teaching and learning as opposed to approaching teaching and learning from a place of judgment and defensiveness? So you mentioned that quite a bit in your
Yeah.
book, and I really loved that. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
take on it.
because
Yeah.
people automatically go into that space, and I think it comes again from education, right?
Mhm.
Where not necessarily that we were directly taught, but it was implied that we just don't talk about race and racism, right? So if somebody were to feel like I was coming to them and saying, well, that's a racist point of view or a racist perspective, they automatically get this defensiveness like, oh, no, I'm not, right? But they think of a racist person in a negative light, and it's not that it's positive, but they see like the really heavy um racist person, and then they don't want to be associated with that,
Yeah.
nor would anybody, I think. Well, nor nor would not a lot of people would like
Yeah.
to be associated with that, right? But what we have to keep in mind and we have to understand is that because we haven't had opportunities to have critical conversations within spaces, then this makes it difficult for people to understand that no, we need to talk about it, because even though you might not have been taught about it, or you might not even know that what you're saying is harmful to others, if we can't have a critical conversation about that, then you're never going to have that opportunity to
Mhm.
learn that, oh my goodness, what I'm saying is racist. I'm not racist. What I'm saying is racist, but I didn't know it was. And
Yeah.
I had a group of students where we were talking about a picture book in the class about a young Black boy who couldn't afford to buy shoes, that lived with his grandmother, and The class then rallied together, I think, and got him shoes at the end. And me, as the educator, at the end of the story, I said, I'm just super curious if anybody can tell me the nationality of the little boy that we're talking about in the storybook. And automatically you felt the whole room go, right?
Yeah.
And they got super defensive. And then what came out of that is because they were in this defensive mode, the conversation turned to how I asked the question rather than what the question was about, which was we are telling a narrative about a young Black
Yeah.
boy who lives in poverty, who doesn't have parents, and who can't afford things within his life. So we're perpetuating the story of a young Black person. And my final question came to them was, I'm really curious who the author of the story is and if that's their story. And so they opened up the book. It was a white female author telling the story,
Yeah.
but the white author said that it was her story, but she used a Black boy for it. And so this
Yeah. Yeah.
perpetuation of who a Black person is through the
Mhm.
eyes of somebody else is harmful
Yeah.
for little Black boys that are listening to that story. And then not only those students that are listening to the story, but all of the other students, because then that reinforces
Yeah.
our understanding and knowledge of that. Right. So instead of using a story like that, like Big Hair Love is such a beautiful book about Black hair and young
Yeah.
women and Black males, like such a beautiful story. And this is the thing that we need to start understanding is that when we as historically silenced people start to tell you what our actual story is, your viewpoint of us changes because you get to have a deeper understanding about who we are as people. And that comes across in all stories that all historically silenced people tell you about.
Yeah.
So I forget what the defensiveness of
Right.
people. So because they didn't want to feel like they were being racist, which they weren't being racist. They just didn't see the problematic issues within the
Mhm.
stories. And until you're able to be open and listen to what the problematic issues are, you're not going to be able to change that. So they could have just as had I not said anything, they could be using that storybook in classrooms
Yeah.
and perpetuating that story, which is not the story we want to tell.
Yeah, and I think that's such an amazing point too, Carolyn, of educators really doing that research into where are the books and resources coming from? Are the children in that space being represented, that that diversity being shown? And um I love how your book outlays so many great tools and that kind of thing throughout for educators. Just wondering your ideas on when we're thinking of those K to 12 students of how parents and caregivers or guardians can kind of take the lead in their own homes with that restoring education as well. What are some tools that they might be able to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I always love to do is whenever we go to a place, I like to learn about the place, learn about the Indigenous people of the place, learn the story prior to it. So whenever you're going like traveling or even going into local places that you even know, and I talk about that through learning from the land, is about let's learn the story of where we are,
Mhm.
whose land we're on, what the land was used prior to settlement to what it's being used for today, and what are the impacts of the Indigenous people for us being here in this moment today. So that's one way that we can learn to understand, but then learn to understand other places too. And then always be curious and be asking questions. What's the representation here of the Indigenous people and where is it highlighted and why is it not highlighted in places? So encouraging your children to be curious and wonder and know that information and know that history of place, because if we only take the history of this place from the perspective of Western colonial settler society, you're saying that this place didn't exist prior to settlement, which is not a true story. And in the beginning of the book, I talk about the bead timeline. Like, I have 500 generations of ancestors that have lived here prior. It's always so funny when people say, well, we have 6 generations. I'm like, yeah, 500. 500 generations. Right? Just like the concept of that, but we weren't taught about that. So what is all this beautiful knowledge that has come before to understand, and how do we learn to live with this land and all of those pieces? And then really making a conscious effort to make sure that the topics and the conversations that you're talking about with your children also include the stories of Indigenous people. If we don't connect what has happened prior to what is happening today, like you were talking about in your opening of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, how are people to know and understand that connection of the Indian Act affects that report? Right? How do we even talk about Pocahontas was the very first missing and murdered Indigenous woman and girl on this continent? So if we're not making those connections, and we go out and we watch and consume all of this media that tells us the opposite of that, then we're not going to be curious about it, right? So the more that we know, the more that we understand. So I encourage people to, I think it's Crave that's really good. I can't remember. There's too many streaming services, but there's one streaming service that differentiates different stories and lived experiences. So I encourage that with my own children and myself, that when we are watching something, that we're watching something that's maybe not something that's in our preview of who we are as people, so that we can better understand. I did an assignment with my students about accessibilities to parks and spaces, and what does that look like? And so I gave them a list of things to look at. And one thing that I missed out on by giving the assignment was I didn't write on accessibility by public transit to get to these places. Right. And none of the places were accessible by public transit, but it wasn't something in my own preview because we have a car. So I didn't think of that, right? So, but now when I think about it, and I think about people in my life who rely on public transit and have mobility issues, they never get to be in these places unless they have other people to take them there. So what does that mean? And so then what does that mean for me asking for leaning into the parks and the places to say this isn't equal? Like we're not allowing people in these spaces, and how are we making it equitable for everyone to enjoy these spaces? Because that's what you say. But that's not the case, right? So I just really want people to be critically thinking about place and space. We went to the Royal Museum yesterday. Some of the signs were just spectacular and really well done. Some of the signs were like, okay, so this is problematic, right? But so they had one sign, which I absolutely get their point, but I get their point as a critical scholar of what they were talking about. And it was a picture of, it was the saloon. And who was in the saloon? Of course, were all white males. And then the question was, would you be able to be in this place in this time frame, right? So like, okay, that's kind of sort of pushing us, right? But if I would have flipped it, if I would have wrote it, it would have said, take a look at the picture. Who do you notice in the picture? And who do you not notice? Who else was living here in this time? And then maybe name some. Do you think that this group of people would be allowed in this space? Right? And then have that conversation. And I think that people really need that really directedness. We can't be vague about things. Right? We have to speak explicitly to it. I get my children are tired of me speaking explicitly to it. But we have to be explicit in what we're asking and what we're, because we can't assume that people understand that that's what we're asking. So that
and then it can also bring in those conversations, right? Where if people have those guiding questions to get them thinking more critically, and then they're partaking in those conversations with others who, like you've said so beautifully in your book, where we're all holders of knowledge, of our own knowledge, of our own lived experiences that we can share with one another and learn from one another, including our students, right? Where
Yeah.
they also have valuable things to share. It shouldn't just be the educator within the space who's looked upon as being all knowing, because none of us are, right?
Yeah,
We all
right.
have things that
Yeah.
we need to learn and that,
Mhm.
and getting those conversations going.
Which is not what the education system taught us. The education
No.
system taught we, the teachers, are supposed to know everything. And I 100% am a wholly, like, completely acceptable if people ask me a question and say, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But we
Same.
can find out together, but I don't know the answer to that. And a lot
Yeah.
of it has to do with place. Like we have I don't know, we have the biggest diverse population of Indigenous people here on the coast compared to where you are. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of things from a lot of different cultures that I don't know about, and I'm okay with that. But
Yeah.
I'm also okay with learning about them and people
Yeah.
sharing that information with me.
And that's where the greatest learning often comes from, is when we're willing to accept that we don't know it all, right?
Yeah.
If we're just trying to pretend that we know it all to get by, there's not going to be any great growth that happens there.
Yeah.
So it's actually a beautiful thing when it's like this realization, oh man, I didn't know that. And now I've partaken in these conversations with others who are able to share other views, or maybe we've researched together, and yeah, just definitely better moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
be open to that. I don't understand people that aren't open to that, to like,
No.
whoa, thank you for sharing. I now know something that I can teach about.
Yeah.
But then people get like so defensive and so rooted in their, but this and this and
Yeah.
this. I'm like, okay, but that's
Yeah.
not it. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, exactly. And I
Yeah.
think too, that piece of like going back to that holding space for others, where, it can be difficult when you hear that, you've done something wrong that has been harmful to other people, and it can, come with some defensiveness and that, but like holding space for one another, that, none of us are perfect. We're learning and growing together, and hopefully moving in a better direction,
Mhm.
because of that relationship building and growth that happens.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So maybe I'll leave a final question with you, Carolyn, if there's any message that you hope people will gain from either viewing this conversation, and also from reading the book and taking part in those critical pieces of thinking, and hopefully collaborating with others. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, what message would you send?
I think that like the biggest hope that I have for the book is that it really opens people up to a space to have conversations and critically think about their places and spaces of where they're at, and then really get them to think about, so what is it that I'm teaching, and how is it that I'm making sure that, like, I know not all students are going to like us. That's okay. It happens, right? It is what it is, as we go through this process. But how am I making sure that I am creating the space where students can be seen and heard and valued in my space? And I think that that's part of just being human and taking care of each other in space. So I just would like people to be more critical about things, and just have more understanding that there's multiple perspectives and multiple stories can happen at the same time, and that doesn't take away from either story. It's just that they happen at similar time frames. So this is this experience, and this is this experience, and then there's this experience, and then this experience.
Yeah.
So there's so many multiple stories that are happening at one time. So how can we better ourselves by knowing all of these stories? So I just encourage people to be curious.
Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful finishing line there. Be curious, right?
Yeah.
Take part
Yeah.
in the listening and the learning, and we'll all be better off for it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. 100%.
Well, thank you so very much for joining us, to have this conversation and sharing your knowledge on the topic, and hopefully spreading the word through your book, and these talks that you're doing, and the wonderful additional work that you're taking part in to make the education system a better place for everyone. And yeah, we look forward to hopefully collaborating more with you in the future. And yeah, just want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's been a good time. Thanks.
Thanks,
Yes,
Carolyn.
thank you. If you don't want to miss any of our upcoming videos, make sure that you hit the subscribe button below as well as the notifications. And you can also visit our website, chaptersforchange.com, for educational resources and to see what we're up to. See you soon.